Hello, third grade friends. If you were not able to come to library time this week, I'm going to share what we read with you so that if you are able to come next week, you'll know where we're at. So for third grade this year, both groups, we're reading Because of Winn, Dixie. The author of this book is Kate DiCamillo, and we have lots of books by this author in the library at Lewis and Clark and the public library as well. So until we can check out books again ourselves, I encourage you to get a public library card. If your parents help you do that, because there's so many good things to read there. So here we go. I'm going to start with Because of Winn, Dixie, Chapter 1. My name is India Opal Baloney, and last summer my daddy, the preacher, sent me to the store for a box of macaroni and cheese, some white rice, and 2 tomatoes. I came back with a dog. This is what happened. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store. That's the name of a grocery store chain in the South, kind of like we have Safeway and Fred Meyer. They have one called Winn-Dixie. I walked into the produce section of the Winn-Dixie grocery store to pick out my 2 tomatoes, and I almost bumped right into the store manager. He was standing there all red-faced, screaming and waving his arms. "Who let a dog in here?" he kept on shouting. "Who let a dirty dog in here?" Well, at first I didn't see a dog. There were just a lot of vegetables rolling around on the floor, tomatoes and onions and green peppers. And there was what seemed like a whole army of Winn-Dixie employees running around, waving their arms just the same way the manager was waving his. And then the dog came running around the corner. He was a big dog and ugly, and he looked like he was having a really good time. His tongue was hanging out and he was wagging his tail. He skidded to a stop and smiled right at me. I had never before in my life seen a dog smile, but that is what he did. He pulled back his lips and showed me all his teeth. Then he wagged his tail so hard that he knocked some oranges off a display that went rolling everywhere, mixing in with the tomatoes and onions and green peppers. The manager screamed, "Somebody grab that dog!" Well, the dog went running over to the manager, wagging his tail and smiling. He stood up on his hind legs. You could tell that all he wanted to do was get face to face with the manager and thank him for the good time he was having in the produce department. But somehow he ended up knocking the manager over. And the manager must have been having a bad day, because lying there on the floor right in front of everybody, he started to cry. The dog leaned over him, real concerned, and licked his face. "Please," said the manager, "somebody call the pound." The pound, you know what that is? Where they take dogs that don't have a family. "Wait a minute," I hollered. "That's my dog. Don't call the pound." All the Winn-Dixie employees turned around and looked at me, and I knew I had done something big, and maybe stupid too. But I couldn't help it. I couldn't let that dog go to the pound. "Here, boy," I said. The dog stopped licking the manager's face and put his ears up in the air and looked at me like he was trying to remember where he knew me from. "Here, boy," I said again. And then I figured the dog was probably just like everybody else in the world, and he would want to get called by a name. Only I didn't know what his name was. So I just said the first thing that came into my head. I said, "Here, Winn-Dixie." And that dog came trotting over to me just like he had been doing it his whole life. The manager sat up and gave me a hard stare, like maybe I was making fun of him. "It's his name," I said. "Honest." The manager said, "Don't you know not to bring a dog into a grocery store?" "Yes, sir," I told him. "He got in by mistake. I'm sorry. It won't happen again." "Come on, Winn-Dixie," I said to the dog. I started walking, and he followed along behind me as I went out of the produce department and down the cereal aisle and past all the cashiers and out the door. Once we were safe outside, I checked him over real careful. He did not look that good. He was big but skinny. You could see his ribs, and there were bald patches all over him, places where he didn't have any fur at all. Mostly, he looked like a big piece of old brown carpet that had been left out in the rain. "You're a mess," I told him. "I'll bet you don't belong to anybody." He smiled at me, and he did that thing again where he pulled back his lips and showed me his teeth. He smiled so big that it made him sneeze. It was like he was saying, I know, I'm a mess. Isn't it funny? It's hard not to immediately fall in love with a dog with a good sense of humor. Come on, I told him. Let's see what the preacher has to say about you. And the two of us, me and Winn Dixie, started walking home. Chapter 2. That summer I found Winn Dixie was also the summer that me and the preacher moved to Naomi, Florida, so he could be the new preacher at the Open Arms Baptist Church of Naomi. My daddy's a good preacher and a nice man, but sometimes it's hard for me to think about him as my daddy because he spends so much time preaching or thinking about preaching or getting ready to preach. And so, in my mind, I think of him as the preacher. Before I was born, he was a missionary in India, and that's how I got my first name. But he calls me by my second name, Opal, because that was his mother's name, and he loved her a lot. Anyway, while me and Winn Dixie walked home, I told him how I got my name, and I told him how I had just moved to Naomi. I also told him about the preacher and how he was a good man, even if he was too distracted with sermons and prayers and suffering people to go grocery shopping. But you know what? I told Winn Dixie. You are a suffering dog, so maybe he will take to you right away. Maybe he'll let me keep you. Winn Dixie looked up at me and wagged his tail. He was kind of limping like something was wrong with one of his legs, and I have to admit, he stunk. Bad. He was an ugly dog, but already I loved him with all my heart. When we got to the Friendly Corners trailer park, I told Winn Dixie that he had to behave right and be quiet, because this was an all-adult trailer park, and the only reason I got to live in it was because the preacher was a preacher, and I was a good, quiet kid. I was what the Friendly Corners trailer park manager, Mr. Alfred, called an exception. And I told Winn Dixie he had to act like an exception too. Specifically, I told him not to pick any fights with Mr. Alfred's cats or Mrs. Detweiler's little yappy Yorkie dog, Samuel. Winn Dixie looked up at me while I was telling him everything, and I swear he understood. Sit, I told him when we got to my trailer. He sat right down. He had good manners. Stay here, I told him. I'll be right back. The preacher was sitting in the living room, working at a little fold-out table. He had papers spread all around him, and he was rubbing his nose, which always means he's thinking hard. Daddy, I said. He said back. Daddy, you know how you always tell me that we should help those less fortunate than ourselves? He said. He rubbed his nose and looked around at his papers. Well, I said, I found a less fortunate at the grocery store. Is that right? He said. Yes, sir, I told him. I stared at the preacher really hard. Sometimes he reminded me of a turtle hiding inside its shell, in there thinking about things and not ever sticking his head out into the world. Daddy, I was wondering, could he stay with us for a while? Finally, the preacher looked up at me. Opal, he said, what are you talking about? I found a dog, I told him, and I want to keep him. No dogs, the preacher said. We've talked about this before. You don't need a dog. I know it, I said. I know I don't need a dog, but this dog needs me. Look, I said, and I went to the trailer door and I hollered, Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie's ears shot up in the air and he grinned and sneezed, and then he came limping up the steps and into the trailer, and he put his head right in the preacher's lap, right on top of a pile of papers. The preacher looked at Winn Dixie. He looked at his ribs and his matted up fur and the places where he was bald. The preacher's nose wrinkled up. Like I said, the dog smelled pretty bad. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher. He pulled back his lips and showed the preacher all of his crooked yellow teeth, and wagged his tail and knocked some of the preacher's papers off the table. Then he sneezed and some more papers fluttered to the floor. What did you call this dog? The preacher asked. Winn Dixie, I whispered. I was afraid to say anything too loud. I could see that Winn Dixie was having a good effect on the preacher. He was making him poke his head out of his shell. Well, said the preacher, he's a stray if I've ever seen one. He put down his pencil and scratched Winn Dixie behind the ears. And a less fortunate too, that's for sure. Are you looking for a home? The preacher asked, real soft, to Winn Dixie. Winn Dixie wagged his tail. Well, said the preacher, I guess you found one. Chapter 3. I started in on Winn-Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath. I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good. I used my own hairbrush and worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. I told him how we were alike. See, I said, you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I mean, I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old, and I can't hardly remember her. And I'll bet you don't remember your mama much either, so we're almost like orphans. Winn-Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have somebody understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have any friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn-Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what? I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when I was in Watley. Winn-Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back, but he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all. I want to know more about her, but I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn-Dixie looked at me hard like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn-Dixie looked at me so hard he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. When I was done working on him, Winn-Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he got into a sneezing fit every time I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and so I took him into the trailer and showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new Winn-Dixie. The preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn-Dixie. Well, now, don't you look handsome? Winn-Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head in the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher. He rubbed Winn-Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said real quick before I lost all my nerve, I've been talking to Winn-Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said. He scratched Winn-Dixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama. Just 10 things, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn-Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into his shell. 1 thing for each year I've been alive, I told him. Please. Winn-Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed. He said to Winn-Dixie, I should have guessed you were going to be trouble. Then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said. Sit down, and I will tell you 10 things about your mama. That's where we're going to stop. That's where my bookmark is. So I hope you enjoyed it. And next week on your library day, I will read the next few chapters, and I'll also record those. So every week there'll be both. So if you miss it in live library time, I'll miss your face, but this will still be available for you, okay? All right, guys, I'll see you soon.